We are not the makers of history, we are made by history. Martin Luther King Jr. Hi, my name is Anjali and my family and I live in Canada, but my parents haven't always lived here in Canada. This is a story about how my parents got to Canada and how history plays a big part in who I am today. This is my place in Canadian history. Let's start from the beginning. My dad was born in a small country in South America called Guyana in 1958, and my mom was born on a small island called Trinidad in 1968. My dad lived in a village called Vreenenhoop for most of his life, and this is also the village that most people were brought from India to work. Indians from India were brought on the plantation fields in villages as indentured laborers. Before they arrived, they were promised a sum of money in return for their work, but ended up getting nothing. Canada had a similar situation occur as Chinese men were brought to work on the Canadian Pacific Railway. These Chinese workers only received $1 a day, even though the whites working on the same railway got paid $1.50 to $2.50 a day. The Chinese also had to pay for their own housing, food, and necessities needed, similar to the Indians in Guyana. This was socially bad for Canada as it continued the discriminatory policies against the Chinese. My mom and dad were living in Guyana and Trinidad at the time both countries were run under the Commonwealth of Britain. Both Guyana and Trinidad had to live under British law and were required to fight in any wars Britain was in. Both countries eventually fought for independence as they saw increased growth in their society and economy. Canada was also under the same Commonwealth and had to follow the same laws until the country gained its independence in 1867 through the BNA Act. Canada also started to become more independent through the Statute of Westminster, and that stated that Britain could no longer make laws for Canada. As my mom finished teachers college and started to look for jobs, she realized there were a lack of job opportunities where she was, due to high unemployment rates. This was a push factor for my mom. This relates to Trinidad's economic problems presently, as they fell into a recession in 2014 due to oil and gas prices falling, and this caused unemployment rates to go up and to decrease the economy. Trinidad is not expected to recover from this recession until 2018. Canada went through a similar recession in 2008 as we were affected by the U.S. financial crisis. The decrease of prices in oil and other Canadian exports played a role in the effects of the financial crisis. Thankfully, the recession was mild and the Canadian economy recovered in 2009. As my dad finished high school, he did not get the opportunity to go to university due to a policy in Guyana. If my dad wanted to go to university, he would have to complete 2 weeks or 3 months of basic military training. This was required for university students of a 2-month to a 12-month program. This policy was put in place by Prime Minister Forbes Burnham. Similarly in Canada was the idea of conscription put in place by Prime Minister Robert Borden in 1917. Volunteers for the war were decreasing and death tolls were increasing. Conscription was put in place to require all able-bodied men to have joined the army. This was militaristically good for Canada as there were more volunteers for the war. Another reason my dad wanted to leave Guyana and to seek home elsewhere is because in Guyana there were race riots going on between blacks and Indians. The riots would consist of physical violence and pressures against the Indians in forms of prejudice in government jobs and school placements. My dad felt unsafe in the country and decided it was time to leave and explore other opportunities. This was also compared to the time when the whites in Vancouver stormed the Chinese camps because they were upset the Chinese had been given the job to work on the CPR instead of the thousands of unemployed Canadian men. Many people were injured and some dashed into the ICC to escape the riot. After looking at different places to immigrate to for a better future, both my parents decided on Canada, due to the fact that the country had a growing economy, and they already had family who had been living here for many years. Pierre Trudeau was Canada's Prime Minister during the time my dad moved here, and he held a stable government system. During the time my mom immigrated, there was a stable government with Jean Chrétien as the PM as well. Both my parents came to Canada because they were sponsored by family members, when 4 new categories were added to the Immigration Act of 1978. One of the categories was to get sponsored by an assistive relative. This act made it easier for my parents to immigrate to Canada in the 90s. It opened up a whole new category for new immigrants to come through, specifically the Caribbean. This was good for Canada socially as it opened up multiculturalism. So my mom reached out to one of her brothers who was already living in Canada, and he sponsored her whole family, but she was the only one who came to Canada at the time. My dad reached out to his aunt, and she sponsored him. My mom took a flight and first arrived in Canada on November 27, 1997. She immediately settled in Brampton, Ontario with her brother. My dad took a flight and landed in Canada on March 12, 1984. He settled with his aunt in Oshawa, Ontario. A very important part of the story is the fact that my parents were only able to immigrate because of Britain's new closed-door policy. This new policy is how my parents were able to immigrate to Canada in the 1980s to the 90s. If it were not for this policy change, only white British subjects would be allowed in Canada, and my parents would have to seek a home elsewhere. The NCA wanted to change the definition of British subject to include British West Indies, regardless of their race, and they even set up an immigration office in the British West Indies. They got support from countries in the Commonwealth and were able to change the policy in the 1960s. 10,682 immigrants came to Canada from the Caribbean, and that is how my parents were able to call Canada their next home. Not long after immigrating, my dad got his Canadian citizenship in 1987, and my mom got her citizenship in 1997. My parents settled in their homes in Canada and realized the climate was very different from what they were used to, and their financial situations were hard to maintain their lifestyle there. My parents met each other through my mom's best friend and started dating in 1998. They flew back to Trinidad in 2001 and got married. Shortly after 2002, they had me, obviously their favorite child and your favorite student. In 2004, my sister was born in Canada. We ended up moving into a house in Mississauga for a better life, where I have been living for around 13 years. Before that, we were living in an apartment at the time close to Toronto, and this is where my parents discovered something similar to what they had in Trinidad and in Guyana, Carnival. Carnival first started in 1783 to celebrate traditions and cultures that Trinidad had. People dress up in costumes and parade around the streets with music and dancing. Something very similar called Caravana is celebrated every year in August in Toronto, where we also celebrate food, dancing, cultures, and traditions that are related to the Caribbean islands. Caravana and other carnivals is something my parents remember celebrating when they were younger, and it was a big part of their festivities in their home country. My parents were happy to find out that Canada has continued to recognize their cultures and traditions. And there you go, the story about how my parents got to Canada. Although it was a long and a hard journey for my parents, we are all happy to be living here now, and to have seen growth in Canada as it has gone through to get to where it is today. If you get the opportunity, always learn about your family's history because you might just discover something interesting.